Hello YouTube and welcome to an all new Elder Scrolls lore video. Today I'm talking about a creature that we have lore on, but which never made it into the game that they were supposed to be in, the Faerie. Now, the story of the Faerie is a bit more complicated than you might think, so let's immediately dive into the lore. So, the Faerie, a creature, or rather creatures, that have been on Tamriel since the creation of the mortal plane. They inhabit all provinces, but apparently more so the Somerset Isles, and they likely also appeared on the other continents of Nirn, like Akavir, Atmora and Altmuris. The creatures are popular in Tamriel's folklore, as they often appear in stories and plays. Their popularity in these stories gives us the origin of the term fairy tale on Tamriel, as that is where that word comes from to the people of Tamriel. However, the word fairy there is written as fairy, the way we know it. Meanwhile, the fairy creatures in the Elder Scrolls universe are written with an A and an E instead of A-I. Anyway, spelling for you. According to most sources, fairies are mischievous in nature. They are known to many as thieves and tricksters and nuisances. They steal gold, sweets and food, and some theorized races of fairies that we do have in the game, like the Nixads, even eat human flesh coated in sugar, specifically preying on children and specifically eating the eyes of human and elven children. But we'll get into the Nixads shortly, as they require some explanation how they relate to the fairies. Anyway, fairies are known by many different names in the different cultures of Tamriel, from fairy to fae to sprites, pixies and sylphim. Each culture also has them in their stories, like I mentioned, and what's striking is that their described behavior in these stories and in the reported sightings of the creatures all around Tamriel all describe different behavioral patterns and different looks for the creatures. The first one that we know of to notice these discrepancies between fairy sightings and their stories was the scholar Artabazus of Firsthold. He theorized in the year 456 of the Second Era that the fairy was not one type of creature, but rather a whole array of different creatures with similar properties. Upon that conclusion, he developed what we now know as the fairy chain theory. This theory organizes all creatures considered by him to be among the fairy types on a chain from the very weak pixies and sprites, which are supposedly looking like will-o'-the-wisps, even though they are completely different creatures, to the almost godlike conus creatures, which are described in Daggerfall, but we never see them in any of the games. In the middle of the chain there are the medium-sized, almost human-like types of fairies we don't have any names for, but we do have some unused sprites for cut content of Daggerfall. These creatures that you see on screen right now are the creatures that most in the community accept that are definitely fairies, as they are cut content, which is quite literally called the Faerie. But like I said, those never made it in, but they do show us that, at least in the mind of the developers at the time, unlike nymphs, which I talked about earlier, which are only female, the fairies do come in both male and female forms. Anyway, let's get back to Artabazus of Firsthold, because he also theorized that the elvish races may be part of the fairy chain, which they are not, as they are the descendants of the Elnovae, the same ancestor race shared by the humans. So that's wrong on his part, but he did theorize it in his fairy chain theory, so it's lore. Here you go. Alright, so what else do we know about the fairy races? Well, something that all fairy races seem to share in common is that they have little form of a society and are often by themselves, not following any leaders of their race or leading any groups themselves. All they do is driven by their own whim and desires and not by long-term goals or higher purposes. Hence why many often behave as tricksters and thieves, mischievously stealing or pulling pranks on mortals. Based on this, the community has theorized that other than the mentioned races of fairies so far, which we never see in any of the games, some races that we do see in the games may be part of Artabazus' fairy chain, specifically the Nixads and the Nereids that we encounter in the Elder Scrolls Online. These creatures resemble very much the type of creatures that have a place on the fairy chain, so are likely going to be part of it if we ever hear of the chain again in any of the games. We also have the Spriggans, which some theorize are part of the fairy chain, but I doubt that, as their origins are quite different. Now, we've got 2 more races of Faerie that we know exist in multiple lore sources and are confirmed to be on the chain of the Faerie, but we never see them. First we've got the Iliadi, a race of so-called forest giants confirmed to be in the chain and present in the lore as having inhabited the Somerset Isles in ancient times. But they've been driven to extinction by the early Altmer colonists as they settled on the Somerset Isles. And finally we have the Gatus, godlike rock spirits apparently also inhabiting the Somerset Isles and also being exterminated by the early Altmer before humans even came to Tamriel, and before Tamriel was even colonized by the Altmer. They exterminated these creatures and the Iliadi in order to make the Somerset Isles a safe place to live for themselves. I don't really know where I mentioned it, but the first years of Altmer colonization of the Somerset Isles were brutal for its native fauna, as a lot of the aggressive creatures on the Isles, which appeared nowhere else on Tamriel due to the island nature of the province of Somerset, they were driven extinct before Tamriel was even colonized, all in an attempt to make the Somerset Isles safe by the early elves. And that's basically all that I can say about the fairies. It's a pretty interesting part of the lore, if I say so myself, and I definitely hope that you learned something. But before we end this video, allow me to say that I hope to see you again in the next Elder Scrolls lore video, and allow me to thank my top Patreon supporters, Mr. Bernardo Binda, Gabriel Binda, Polarized Putin, Athena Iodis, King Chris, Scribe of the Scrolls, Doji, Fenrir, Sword of Bushido, Zar Mekal, and Mr. Christmas. It is thanks to these people and all the others on screen that this channel stays alive, and for that I am very grateful. That said, I hope to see you all in the next Elder Scrolls lore video. Bye bye.